on this episode of Rebel Spirit Radio.
Sylvia shared with her mother in letters all the time about Ouija board sessions and astrology and wanting to learn the tarot and automatic writing and wanting to, she wanted her and Ted to be better than George and William Butler Yeats and their Georgie was Yeats's wife. And, she had many aspirations toward the occult and mysticism. And the funny thing is, it's all there for anyone to read. If you read Plath's letters, if you read Plath's journals, some of it's a little more, you got to dig a little more to find like my archival stuff. But no one has thought to view this seriously.
Welcome to Rebel Spirit Radio, exploring the frontiers of spirituality, consciousness, the esoteric, and humanity's sacred relationship with the living earth. I'm your host, Nick Mather, and in this episode, author Julia Gordon Bramer returns to the podcast to discuss her latest book, The Occult Sylvia Plath. Julia discusses esoteric themes woven into Plath's work, her immersion in alchemy via her mother's master's degree on Paracelsus, the ways in which the structure of the novel The Bell Jar aligns with Kabbalah, and how sexism has blinded scholars to the mystical in Plath's work. Also, please be sure to like and subscribe to this podcast on whatever platform you use to listen to or view podcasts. Your support is truly appreciated. Julia Gordon Bramer is a Sylvia Plath scholar, professional tarot card reader, award-winning writer and poet, and former professor for the graduate writing program at Lindenwood University. She is the author of several books, including Fixed Stars Govern a Life, Decoding Sylvia Plath, and Tarot Life Lessons. She joins me today to discuss her latest book, The Occult Sylvia Plath. Julia, welcome back to Rebel Spirit Radio.
Thank you, Nick. I'm so happy to be here.
Well, I'm really excited to speak with you. I first want to say congratulations on the book. I told you before I hit record that I finished reading it last evening, and I enjoyed it very, very much. I have a little bit of familiarity, coffee still kicking in, with Sylvia Plath. I read The Bell Jar twice, probably about 30 years ago, so I don't remember too much. And I believe I read her collection of poetry, Ariel. But again, that would have been a very, very long time ago. But I thought that maybe the best place to begin our conversation, I assume that my audience is rather intelligent, but for my faithful listeners and viewers who may not be familiar with Sylvia Plath, I thought that maybe we could start just by a brief overview of who she was. And in conjunction with that, I'd like to know what stirred your interest in her and her work.
Sure. Well, I'd like to just say, your little bit of reading on Plath is more than a lot of people. Many people don't know who she is, although a lot of people have heard her name, and some people know there was a lot of drama and even suicide attached to her name. She's kind of known as the poet who put her head in the oven, right, most unfortunately. And that's true. She did die by suicide, gassing herself. But there's so much more. She is one of the great American contemporary poets of our time, certainly one of the first feminist poets, and that's kind of what she's known for if you dig a little deeper. I say poets, also a writer, also, author of the novel The Bell Jar, which was a highly autobiographical novel. Some people believe it's perfect autobiography. I do not. And I can talk to you more about that. But she's one of the first writers from the early 1960s who really dared to get out of traditional female territory. She got angry, she got ugly. She, her and her buddy Anne Sexton, they did break a lot of rules and, were not necessarily, they had some success in their lifetime, but nothing like posthumously. But, there is that rock star immortality of dying young and beautiful, and it kind of keeps you in the myth forever and ever.
Yeah. So what attracted you to her work?
Yeah. So I found Plath when I was 16, which interestingly is the year that I discovered the tarot
Mm,
myself, which I write in my book that I've talked to you about on a previous episode, Tarot
mm,
Life Lessons. I talk, Plath is in there a little bit
right.
in my story. And initially, I don't know, my copy of the Bell Jar was what I found first, and I read it. It was in a book of my dad's old discarded paperbacks in the garage, and I picked it up, and it had a poem in the back of my version called Mad Girl's Love Song. And that poem really captivated me, and which is interesting because it's not in her collected poems, and it's
Mm,
it's very kind of obscure. She wrote it when she was like 19. But wow, that poem kind of did something to me, maybe because I was a teenager and it just hit me hard. But even then, I didn't have a real understanding of poetry. I wrote some on my own. I'm also a poet
mm,
myself. And yeah, I think that I was just sort of feeling my way around Plath like most people did at a young age, interested in her anger, interested in her apparent darkness. This was kind of all surface meanings. And that's where most people leave her.
mm,
When I got into undergraduate school, I found some more of her poetry and enjoyed her a little more. But it wasn't until graduate school when I was, I can say in graduate school, I was a fully developed poet myself. So I wasn't still learning the mechanics of enjambment and all
yeah.
the all those terms. I had a real grasp of what Plath was doing in a way that I didn't in my younger years, to appreciate her genius just on the structural level. But that was when, as a tarot card reader, which I also am, I saw all of this tarot imagery. And what I've told in many other interviews is I went to my professor and I said, "What's going on here? I can't find anything about this." And he said that he had never heard anybody talk about tarot in Plath. And he trusted me with the tarot. He knew I was very good at
Mm,
it. And he said, "Make that your semester end project." And
mm,
so, what was my semester end project ultimately became my life's work. I discovered that Plath had layered at least 6 different meanings into every aerial poem, all kind of in perfect alignment with tarot and Kabbalah. That work on Plath got me headlong into Kabbalah. I had never studied that before. So, 15 years into Kabbalah now, if not more than that, and I still feel like a novice. It's very deep and intense. Again, it just shows Plath's genius to have absorbed all of this at 30 years old. But but
yeah.
yeah, she would make one set of words, one poem in Ariel have 6 different meanings.
Mm,
And to understand that, and to be given the framework and say, okay, read this alchemically, read this as a history, as his history piece, read this in regard to this piece of art. It's like mind blowing. Like, I can't believe what she was able to do with one set of words. And so my passion just got exponential. I can't stop talking about her.
Well, it's wonderful when you find a passion like that, I think. And it definitely shows in the book. It was incredibly well written and researched and so engaging. And even though I had read a little bit of Plath, I really didn't know much about her at all. And one of the notes that I have was the context of when she lived, because she was a product of, I think she was born sometime in the 1940s and
30s,
30s.
32.
Okay, 32. Okay. But she was, she came of age in that time in the 1950s when women were supposed to be in the kitchen and support their men and not be heard and whatnot. And she did eventually become this sort of feminist icon,
Mhm.
you know?
Yeah, but she wrestled with her times because
Yeah,
she wanted to also be the perfect wife and mother. And
right.
she wrote several times, "I don't want to be one of those career women," like it
Mm,
was this thing to be disdained, it was disdained. And yeah, I think she was naturally feisty and ornery and her own person and super ambitious. I mean,
Right.
she was ambitious from the time she was a little girl. At 8 years old, she had her first major publication.
Oh,
And by the time she finished high school, she had had many national publications that would make any adult writer envious.
right.
And, like really popular magazines. So she just had this burning ambition that could not be stopped. And so even though she was also a product of her times, and even though she wanted to put her husband Ted Hughes's career first, and she supported him, and she was really his secretary and his agent and all of that, she still, had to succeed on her own.
Yeah, I felt so humbled by reading about how she did have these writings and poems published when she was in high school. And you noted, I think it was a high school paper, and it may have been a final high school paper. It was called On Intimations, where you wrote that she discussed spirituality as a necessary condition of art and the inner divinity of man, and positioned the artist as a medium of transmission and a reflecting awareness of divinity.
How
And
cool is that, huh?
I know, and in high school.
Yeah, right. Yeah, like I'm coming to that at 60 years old,
Right, right, right. Me too. Me too. Well, and as reading the book and kind of thinking about Sylvia and her husband, Ted Hughes, I started really reflecting on the idea of a poet. And I looked up the etymology of poet, and it didn't really answer the question because I was thinking of poet and that idea of inspiration, that there's this divine element of being a poet and expressing something transcendental of
It's
sorts.
a channeling. And I think anyone who's written poetry has that moment. I have a poem that I remember writing clearly called Fist, which won a first prize award at the
Mm.
St. Louis Poetry Center, and was later published in Clemson Poetry Review, I think. But I remember I was walking home I had about a mile walk from our fitness center, and I was walking home on a hot summer day, and it was just coming to me line by line, and that's channeling, that's automatic writing.
Right.
And I was astounded because I could tell I was onto something. I could tell it had, some double meanings here, and that, and it, and interestingly, it was sort of boxing imagery, and I have nothing to do with boxing, but it made for a fine metaphor. And as I said, it ended up winning me an award, and it was just a sort of tight, neat little poem, but I feel like it was given to me, and that is not an unusual experience with poets. I think, and other writers, I'm sure. Sometimes we dream them. Sometimes lines just hit us. You're in the grocery store, or you're on, working out, or usually in the shower. Usually it's in some inopportune place, right?
Right.
But I think even part of that is because we're relaxed and we're
Mm.
just not trying, and we're open to it. And it is kind of a holy spiritual thing. I think musicians may know how to dip into that creative vibe when they play in a more, they're kind of consciously going into subconscious.
Right.
Writers, we're so in our head often that it's maybe a little harder for us. I think painters also can get really lost in their work. Sometimes as writers, sometimes we're hung up on the technique or the form or the
Mm.
spelling or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. We have to kind of silence that inner editor, I think, at
Yeah,
times. Right. Right.
truly.
So let's look back at Sylvia Plath here. And I do want to talk about Ted Hughes because that's such a huge part of her story. But let's look a little bit about her history. She was raised in the Unitarian Church, correct?
Yes, yeah. Universalist Unitarian or Unitarian Universalist. I forget which way it goes. Yeah, and I think that was very influential. And she's made notes of her Sunday school homework being studies of the zodiac,
Right,
like my Sunday school was nothing like that.
right.
And I had an interesting Sunday school.
Mm,
I talk about that in my former book, that my Sunday school had automatic writing and they
mm,
spoke in tongues and things like that. But no, we didn't get into the zodiac. And so in mythology, which is closely related to the zodiac, She went on a lot of retreats. There's at a place called Star Island, which is very kind of spooky in and of itself. It's full of ghost stories and all kinds of lore that way. Yeah, she had a big influence from her church, and she did say to the end of her life that the Unitarian Church was where she felt she belonged.
Mm.
She had some problems in Devon, and in those last couple of years, she had tried to become part of the I believe it was Anglican, which is another version of Episcopalian church in Devon, England, and they weren't very welcoming to her. They called her and Ted educated pagans,
Yeah.
and yeah, but Universalist Unitarian, that's
Yeah.
what spoke to her.
Yeah. Well, it's the Unitarian. I'm just going to say the Unitarians for short.
Okay.
I know that they're very non-dogmatic.
Yeah.
And I have a real quick story. When I was in graduate school, I took a course on psychology and religion, and it was a mix of graduate students and undergraduate students. And the goal was that students had to go to a religious service 3 times and then kind of write, using a psychological theory. And the graduate students were in charge. We had to lead a group of undergrads. And so the first day they put on the board what students would like to see, what kind of religion would they like to look at. And one small group of students said, we want to look at paganism. We want to look at Wicca. I'm like, well, I'll take that one on. And I actually found a coven in Denver through the Unitarian Church here, one of the local Unitarian churches, because they were
Wow.
they would invite the pagan community in for full moon rituals every month. And that's how I connected. So, and even if you look at sort of the foundation with like Ralph Waldo Emerson,
The Transcendentalists.
the transcendentalist and this idea of nature.
Uh-huh.
And that was something that was very important to Sylvia Plath as well, was this
That's
relationship
right.
to nature, right?
And the Transcendentalists all were from her area too, from her
Yeah.
region. And she loved history, and she loved Boston and Massachusetts, and
Mhm.
yeah, so it all kind of feeds in. I wish I had talked to you while I was writing that book, because I might have gone deeper into the whole Unitarian thing to know that
Yeah.
they opened up to pagans. That may have happened in her time. We don't know.
Yeah.
I don't have any documented evidence of it, but if that's normal for the Unitarian Church, that she may have had a very early introduction to that I was unaware of. So
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know that at her time they would have opened up to pagans, but there would have been that focus on nature, I think,
yeah.
because of Emerson. And I know my aunt and uncle are Unitarians, that the church will often invite people from different denominations in to give speeches on Sunday. So they'll, invite someone from the Hindu tradition, for example, to talk about the Bhagavad Gita or whatnot. So
Cool.
very, very open, very
Yeah.
open. And also, in conjunction with this kind of open spirituality, there was also I don't want to say a focus, but what you would consider sort of occult things. For example, she and her mother, I think at one point you wrote that they practiced telepathy together.
Yeah. Yeah. And and I believe her mother was the one who said that in a
Mm.
letter, or in some writing or some interview. Yeah, it might be in letters home that she said it. They were very close
Yeah.
and very connected, and her mother was not a stranger to mysticism either. She got her master's degree on Paracelsus, the famous alchemist, really the first alchemist. And Aurelia Plath said that Sylvia read all of her school books. So Sylvia was completely immersed in alchemy from that, if nothing else. But yeah, Sylvia shared with her mother in letters all the time about Ouija board sessions and astrology and wanting to learn the tarot and automatic writing, and wanting to, she wanted her and Ted to be better than George and William Butler Yeats, and their Georgie was Yeats's wife. And, yeah, she had many aspirations toward the occult and mysticism. And the funny thing is, it's all there for anyone to read. If you read Plath's letters, if you read Plath's journals, some of it's a little more, you got to dig a little more to find like my archival stuff. But no one has thought to view this seriously, and to understand the huge influence it was. And no one has really taken it all collectively. And, Plath scholars know, oh yeah, they played with Ouija board, but they kind of just dismiss it. They know that she used bibliomancy to decide whether to get the final house that she lived in, but they just kind of, whatever. Yeah, Yeats, she opened up a Yeats book and stuck her finger on a line. and she's been photographed with her crystal ball. That's actually Plath on the cover of my book. And people just haven't put it all together. It's astounding. They've done it for Ted Hughes. His work has been widely studied for the alchemy and the astrology and the Kabbalah, and it's they know his is loaded with all this kind of occult meaning, and yet and they know that he was a mentor to Sylvia, and that until the end of their marriage, she worshipped him. But they never looked at her work. It's astounding.
Wow. Yeah, it's interesting. Partly, I want to say that academia has a blind spot frequently to these sorts of things, but yet, and maybe it was just so prevalent in the work of Ted Hughes that they couldn't possibly ignore it. But yeah, there's this blind spot, and it's so important because it's there, and it's there in not just Sylvia's poetry, but also, like Yeats, he was a member of the Golden Dawn, I believe. So there's this ongoing tradition. And I'm curious, you noted in the book, in terms of Sylvia's poetry, that she's usually referred to as a confessional poet. But I wonder if this added layer, or this, recognition of this added depth, would we describe her as a different kind of poet? And if so, what kind?
Right. Well, I open up the Occult Sylvia Plath with a quote by Ted Hughes that says, and I may not get it completely right, but she was not a confessional poet, but rather a mystical poet of the highest order. That's what Ted Hughes said of his wife. And so everyone wants to put her in that box. They want to hold her to that narrow view of only being depressive and hysterical, as Harold Bloom called her. To mention Bloom for a minute, he wrote widely on the poets who used Kabbalah, and he has a book about Kabbalah in the literary world. And he has also written an introduction on a Plath biography. And in that Plath biography, he called Sylvia Plath hysterical. He was able to see the Kabbalah in the men's writing, but not in the women's. Wow. And I just that blows my mind. I mean, I think there's absolute sexism going on here.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
And there's a way that we've liked to view her, because she was a woman, because she, yes, she was mentally unstable. Absolutely, she was. She was institutionalized. She had shock therapy. She attempted suicide more than a couple of times and was ultimately successful. So she was not the most well-grounded, secure person. But that does not negate her genius. And I just believe she was a genius's genius. And so it's really my calling, I think, to validate that and to get it in front of people so they can see what she was doing. The Occult Sylvia Plath was supposed to be the introduction to my first book initially. My first book, Fixed Stars Govern a Life, Decoding Sylvia Plath, that's more literary analysis. The Occult Sylvia Plath turned into a biography. So this is much more readable. The literary analysis is going line by line and showing what her poetry can do. But I began with this introduction that it took on a life of its own and became the Occult Sylvia Plath. I knew it was going to be too much, too wieldy. It ended up being over 15 years in the Plath archives, but I'm happy with it. I'm really happy with it.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you have every right to be happy with it. It's a really good book. So I was curious when I was reading, especially when you were looking at her early years. I know that there was some trauma, especially with the death of her father when she was 8 years old. But the sense that I got was that she seemed to be happy for the most part until that summer when she had that internship at Mademoiselle, which
Yeah.
is the basis of the bell jar. And
Yeah.
it was like just reading that because even before, I think you had quoted her saying, I just love life or something like that.
Right.
And then all
It,
of a
it's
sudden, boom, different.
Yeah, it's funny because in some interviews that Plath did, she has said that she was not really a happy little girl.
Oh,
But all the evidence points to the contrary. And her mother has said she seemed to be very happy. And I do think it was like a late teens thing.
mm,
She may have repressed a lot, like she was not allowed to go to her father's funeral. Her father died
right,
when he was 8. I'm sure there was pain there that wasn't expressed, and I'm sure it caused some emotional damage. How could it not?
right.
But overall, she seemed remarkably well adjusted. She had loads of friends and boyfriends. She was active in all the school committees and
Mm,
doing all the sports and the music and I mean, she was just super achiever all the way around. And yeah, it's very interesting that it's like a switch flipped
yeah.
and something happened on maybe on a biological level. We don't
Mm,
know.
yeah.
I
Yeah.
think there's pretty good evidence that she was bipolar.
Okay. Yeah, that's what I was thinking. It seemed that there were these mood swings
Mhm.
happening where there was like this, I guess they would define it as being manic, that where she was like elated with life and just the act of living and being involved, and then the depression.
Yeah, then lower than anyone could get, right?
Yeah, yeah. Well, it was interesting that really that internship did it, and it became the focus of the bell jar.
I think that might break me too, though. I mean,
Yeah,
what she went through. She was the falseness of it in New
right.
York, and their little gloves and pillbox hats, and they had to wear wool clothes on a hot summer day and
Uh,
photograph smiling, and and she had attempted rape, and she
mm,
had food poisoning, and yeah, and a ridiculous work schedule that was relentless, and yeah, it
mm,
was a lot.
yeah. Well, it makes me think, the description of like the photos and whatnot of just how women were treated at that time and the image, that of the housekeeper and even in fashion and whatnot, I think there was this ideal woman, which was not what she wanted to be necessarily. Or maybe I'm
Right.
wrong. Because you did say that she kind of goes back and forth between.
Yeah, yeah. I think she rebelled against it, and yet she really wanted to be the epitome of that. You
Right,
know,
right.
she
Yeah,
wanted to be perfect in all
yeah,
things.
yeah, yeah. And you noted that with the family history, the
Mhm.
Germanic family history of this idea of perfectionism.
Yeah.
Yeah, that can rustle any of us, I think. So after this experience, you noted that like ideas of magic began creeping into her stories. And I was also curious about the bell jar because you mention it many, many times, but I'm also wondering, is there anything occult-ish in that book? Because it seems to me, if I remember correctly, most of what you were pulling from for, like with the astrology and the alchemy and whatnot, is all in the poetry. But
Right.
is there anything in the bell jar itself?
The structure of the bell jar is entirely in alignment with Kabbalah and
Okay.
tarot. And
Okay.
I have measured it out, and I
Mhm.
have each card next to each line in my copy. Funnily enough, the copy I used was that first copy that I
Yeah.
had when I was 16. I
Right.
still had it. And yeah, I remember getting my oil changed, and some guy looking at me and asking why I was writing in my book. And I
Yeah.
was just, you know, just a high priestess.
Yeah.
empress, emperor, and just line by line by line showing how, as she wrote it, each line she used a tarot card to kind of jump off and to say the next thing. And it's her story,
Right.
but she knew how to mold it with the right words to kind of cast that spell. So it's not obvious. It's not like in her poem Daddy, and she says, and my tarot pack,
Right.
I may be a bit of a Jew, and the Jewish reference referring to Kabbalah, and tarot being tarot, of course. And so she's in her poetry, sometimes she was more outward about it. And of course she has titles like Ouija and the Hanging Man, and but the bell jar, it's there, but it is not a mystical story.
Right.
Very much her story.
Yeah. Yeah. And I was really happy to read because this was my own intuition. I think that I came to the bell jar at the same time that I was reading J.D. Salinger. And
Yeah.
I immediately noted a similarity in tone.
And she wanted that. She wanted
Yeah.
to write her version of The
Right.
Catcher in the Rye. And and I probably found The Catcher in the Rye about the same age too. I mean, it's a very teenage book,
Right.
right?
Right. Right.
So
Right. Yeah. Well, she always reminded me more a little bit of Franny and Zooey,
uh-huh.
actually. Yeah.
And she has a poem that actually is a nod to that collection. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, she loved Salinger, and
Yeah.
he influenced quite a bit of her work.
Yeah. Interesting. Interesting. So now I want to reread the bell jar in terms of tarot. And I know that you noted that she never used tarot, or at least there's no evidence that she used tarot for fortune telling. But
Oh,
she,
there's
is there?
evidence of that.
Oh, is there?
Yeah.
Okay.
I
All
mean,
right.
she had her tarot deck that she took to parties
Okay.
sometimes.
All right.
So she was doing something with it at
Okay. All right.
parties, so
All right.
that's usually fortune telling.
Right, right, right. Yeah, but she also used it for what you noted was like self-development, and I think she used it for her art, her poetry.
Yes. Yes,
Yeah.
she kept a tarot deck on her desk.
Mm,
She probably got her first exposure to tarot as the game Taroki with
mm,
her family. But her first and most important doctor, Dr. Ruth Boysher, used tarot in her recovery from her
right.
suicide attempt.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I was going to, that's where I was kind of heading, was the relationship with
Mhm.
her therapist, because the therapist was using some what would be considered non-conventional
Right. Quite
modalities.
unorthodox.
Yeah.
Hmm.
But
Yeah.
she had an ongoing relationship with this therapist.
She did, and it was not really ethical by our professional standards today. I mean, Ruth Boysher came to Plath and Hughes's home,
Mm,
and vice versa. And, there were so many boundaries crossed that we would never do today with a doctor-patient relationship. She said she loved her. She said she
mm,
dearly loved Sylvia. And I know it was mutual. It was Dr. Boysher was younger than most of the doctors, and she had I don't know if she just finished her fellowship or something, but she
mm,
wasn't quite a full doctor yet when
mm,
Plath was her student, or her patient. And I think that, she maybe invested everything in Sylvia's recovery
mm.
for her own kind of needs, professional accomplishment, and sort of her first big story, big patient. But yeah, it was not the way a doctor patient relationship would be handled today, for sure.
Right. One of the other things, and this is, I'm trying to divide this up as like pre-Ted Hughes and after Ted Hughes in a sense, but you also noted that Sylvia had premonitions, and
Yeah.
that seems to have gone throughout her life.
Yes, yeah, starting when she was quite a young girl. And I think I have something about her documenting, it's at least her first documented premonition, and she calls it a flash, I believe it
Mm,
is, when she
yeah,
was around maybe 9 or 10, something like that. And just that inner knowing, or waking up from a dream,
mm,
things like that.
yeah,
She dreamt a lot of premonitions. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Well, and it seems like that's part of the poetic vocation as well, as we were talking
Yeah,
about before, you know.
absolutely.
So she ends up after college, she went to Smith College, and that's in Boston. Is that
Mhm.
correct? Okay.
Northampton. So yeah,
Northampton. Okay.
Mhm.
in that area. And she had poetry accepted while she was in college. She continued to submit, and she ends up going to England, to Cambridge University. And that's when she meets Ted Hughes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, what can you say about Sylvia Plath and her relationship with Ted Hughes? A big question.
There's a
Yeah.
lot, and most
Yeah.
of it I've said in the book.
Yeah. Right.
But
Right.
what I will say is they were the rock star poet couple.
Mm,
They were both gorgeous. They were both geniuses. They were really great compliments to each other. And for as much as Ted is hated for what he did to Sylvia, I hope that my book shows that he should also be loved for,
mm,
lifting her up and
right.
pushing her and encouraging her. Now he may have pushed her too far,
Mm,
and he's even said that,
mm,
but he saw what she was capable of,
right.
and he wanted her to maximize it. And the two of them believed poetry was more important than anything,
Mm,
including their lives, including their marriage.
mm,
And I almost wonder if he and his dalliances with other women and what have you, what wasn't always just pushing the envelope of experience
mm,
for his art,
right.
that can be argued, and maybe all poets do that to a point, I don't know. But I think I do somewhat. Like you want to live as fully as you can and as
Right.
richly and deeply as you can, and you want to feel feelings to their dregs,
Yeah.
so that you can capture that in art. So they were definitely that way, both of them. There was that movie that came out in the early 2000s starring Gwyneth Paltrow and Daniel Craig as Sylvia Plath and Ted Hughes. It was called Sylvia. I don't know if you've
Mm.
heard of it or seen
No,
it.
I didn't know
Um,
that.
yeah, it's not a bad movie, except it's only about their drama and,
Oh.
and how beautiful they were. There is a little bit. Actually a great scene in it of Ted Hughes, Daniel Craig, at the bar talking about poetry and talking about how it's an incantation and a
Mm,
spell. And I think it's very good. I think it's a very good scene. They were not allowed to use their actual words, but I think that the filmmakers really captured Ted's thoughts and spirit
mm,
on that. And so it's all about the drama, and that's what everybody knows. And it's a great story, makes for a
yeah.
great story. They were
Right.
beautiful, they were wild. They met at this party and she bit him on the cheek and drew
Right.
blood, and it's crazy, right?
Yeah.
And they were married 4 months later, and you
Yeah.
know but
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Sometimes souls meet that are destined to meet, and that's
Yeah.
kind of what it came across in the book. But, and also, one of the things I really appreciated in your writing was that both characters were, or, both, I shouldn't refer to them as characters, but both Sylvia and Ted were represented as being imperfect beings,
And and what I hope I did was, I wanted to show everyone in that family, both families.
yeah,
Her parents have been vilified.
right.
Aurelia Plath has been called the smother mother and the
Mm,
Medusa, and her father has been, the brute and the
mm,
and just that awful father, cold hearted, and then Ted, of course, has been vilified beyond belief.
right.
And I wanted to show where they all came from and their humanity. And I
Yeah,
also didn't want to show Sylvia Plath as the perfect heroine.
right.
There are so many books that worship her, and she was human,
Hmm.
and she was very human. And she had her racist comments,
Hmm.
and she had her, just bitchy, jealous rages, and her bipolarity, and
Right.
and a lot of other things too. So I hope that I'm fairly presenting. And I said this at the end of my introduction. I wanted this to be a group of imperfect people who were
Mm.
doing their best,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah. I know. I think you succeeded in that because I was amazed to learn so much more about Sylvia Plath, but at the same time, I really appreciated that you were not afraid to look at the warts.
Yeah.
as it
Uh-huh.
were, and that you didn't demonize Ted Hughes. And I think it came across that, after her death, that he was largely responsible in many ways for getting her work out there.
Oh
And
yeah.
if it wasn't for him, we wouldn't be maybe not be having this conversation.
Right. And he suffered for what he
Yeah.
did.
Yeah.
And and he took on being sued for that bell jar movie, which had nothing
Right.
to do with him.
Right.
And
Right.
he lost a fortune from it. And
Yeah.
he and of course maybe the most horrible thing of all was the subsequent suicide of Asha Wevel and
Yeah.
their daughter that
Right.
she took with her. So he lived with a lot of guilt and a lot of pain. And I mean, yeah, he was kind of a scoundrel and certainly a
Yeah.
philanderer. he
Yeah.
he could not resist the women, that's clear.
Yeah. Yeah.
But he suffered for it.
Hmm.
And his life was not perfect.
Right. Right. And, to talk about him just for a moment, I had mentioned earlier the sort of vocation of the poet, and it seemed to me that he was trying to embody that, because one of the recurring or main sort of archetypal themes that he seemed to try to embrace was that of the shaman. And he
Mhm.
saw the sort of the shaman's initiation, that dismemberment and rememberment, as the poetic act. Is that right?
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And he tumbled into the fireplace when he was 3 or 4 years old.
Mm,
And he looked
right.
at that as his first shamanic act.
Right, right, right.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think it takes poetry to its source, it takes it
Hmm.
to its source. There are a couple of things that run through the book, and one is Sylvia and Ted utilizing the Ouija board.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
So the book is in 4 parts.
Hmm.
There's the first part of Plath's family, the second part of Plath growing up, the third part, Ted Hughes. Do I have that right? I think I screwed that
Yeah.
up a little bit. Anyway, we've got them both growing up in their
Right.
childhoods. And we've got Plath as a young adult, then we've got them together, and then we've got after Plath.
Right.
And each part opens up with a Ouija board
Mm,
scene. And that scene is very carefully taken from Plath's poem Dialogue Over a Ouija Board.
mm,
And it is every detail that I used came from either that poem or from filler from, if she talked in a letter to her mother about what she had in the room, how she and Ted were decorating, what the smell was like in that
mm.
room. I used all information from Plath's writings in addition to the dialogue over a Ouija board to really flesh out those scenes. But yeah, it's a long poem, and I wanted a very visceral kind of experience, like we were I wanted to take it beyond a regular, this is the creative writer in me.
Right, right.
I wanted to take it beyond a regular biography where
Mm.
I'm just narrating, and have a real in the moment scene where we can feel it and experience it with them and what it might have been like.
Yeah. And what was the importance of these, I guess I would say, the Ouija experience, because they were communicating, maybe in quotes, I don't know, with a spirit named Pan. Is that right?
Yeah, yeah. Pan, the goat god. Some people think of him as the devil.
Right.
In the tarot, he's in alignment with the Fool card. He's Bacchus or
Mhm,
Dionysus.
mhm,
And yeah, and it's an interesting selection of gods. The Fool card is number 0, and in the tarot, it's neither the major arcana or the minor arcana. It's thought of as a bridge or a limbo.
right.
And so, interesting that is sort of their liminal place between being alive and the world
Mm.
of the spirits. And she was trying to find her father.
Okay.
And so she was asking him,
Mm.
how is my father? Is he all right? Is he there? Yeah, interesting.
Yeah. And when you talk about the Fool card, what comes to my mind is actually Aleister Crowley's Fool card, because there it specifically states that, or, is the Dionysian aspect to it.
Yeah.
And Hughes was familiar with Crowley's work. And one of the things that, if I remember right, it was I don't want to say a meditation technique, but it was a technique of altering consciousness. And Hughes did this kind of work with Sylvia a lot, with like
Yes.
hypnosis and various other practices of achieving these altered states. And I imagine that that would be in part for the poetic endeavor, right?
Oh, sure. Yeah. I mean, even before Sylvia, even as a boy, he had that Prester John book that he believed he had found a magical phrase in it called, I think, the Blesbox or proving ground or something, something really, really odd. But it to him, he would speak this or use it like a mantra, and he would feel physical changes in his body, and he would grow icy
Mm,
cold, and he would, and he believed that it had this power, and that was as a boy that he was
yeah,
doing that.
right.
So it just accelerated.
Yeah. Yeah. And I know you noted that they really didn't want to, or Ted didn't want to really make it known that he knew or studied Crowley's work, or Crowley's work, excuse me, because of Crowley's reputation in England.
Yeah, well, I mean, there was a lot to that. So really the
Yeah.
occult in general, it was kept
Mm,
hush hush
mm,
because witchcraft had only been taken off the books as a crime in England in 1951, I believe it
yeah.
was. And they got together in 1956. So, a very short time before. So there was still a lot of stigma attached to it, and it was very frowned upon, not Christian. These
Right.
were quite conservative times, and most people were Christian, and so it was just thought to be really uncomfortable and ugly and even evil.
Right.
They had two young children that they didn't want their reputations, marred by this, and so there were a lot of reasons to not speak it. None of, the most important one being that Sylvia had a history of mental illness,
Right.
and and to have the occult thrown in the mix,
Yeah. Yeah.
that wouldn't go over well in academia.
Right. Yeah. And you had noted, I forget the full name. I want to say it was someone, Alvarez or something, had kind of
A. Alvarez.
had kind of hypothesized that maybe their downfall had something to do with dark magic.
Yeah, yeah. He wrote an article called something like "Did Black Magic Kill
Mm,
Sylvia Plath?" Yeah.
right.
And he knew Plath and Hughes pretty well. I don't think that article said all that much that anyone
Yeah.
didn't know already. But it was on people's minds that they were doing something with it.
Yeah. 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 Now, I had noted here at one point where you noted that ideas of magic crept into her stories and in her poetry. And I'm curious about the practice of magic. Were her poems kinds of invocations?
Yeah, I think absolutely they were. I mean, I think poetry is, in
Yeah.
a way. And that gets back to our first comments about poetry being kind of a channeling. I like to say the Bible says, in the beginning was the Word,
Mm,
and the Word was with God, and the
right.
Word was God.
Right.
So that's in, I believe, John,
Right.
and the book of John. And the Word is all powerful.
Mm,
And the word is, we get the word spelling from casting a spell,
right. Right.
and so we know on this sort of primitive level that this communication, that words create our reality, that words can mold us and shape us. So when Plath was writing a poem, one of her better aerial poems, when she was developed as a poet,
Mm,
and she was able to instill a mythological component and a tarot Kabbalah component and a component of history in the world and a component of alchemy and a component of astrology and or astronomy and a component of the arts and humanities. I mean, every single poem had all of this. So she knew that she was layering these resonant feelings we might not get it here,
Mm.
but we feel it. We feel that mysticism. We feel the mythology. We feel the alchemy. We might not understand it, but it's doing something to us.
Right.
So she learned that from Ted fully. You know,
Yeah.
Ted Hughes had said that she really didn't become a poet until like the time she was with him. And a lot of scholars have been like, oh, you know, how arrogant of him to say that. But I think it's absolutely true. I think she was developing and she was getting her skills, you know, getting her feet wet in some of this layering. And I found some very good examples in her juvenilia. She's got a poem called Temper of Time or something like that. And it's got its double meaning. You know, it's sort of one set of words that says one thing, but it also is a reflection of her newspaper, you know, and the Times.
Right.
And she's got a lot of newspaper imagery in it. So she was learning that words could do more than one thing. And it's amazing to me that so many people who teach poetry don't know what poetry can do.
Right.
And poets know, but the teachers don't seem to get it, you know.
Yeah.
And you know, I would advise any poetry student, if you're going to study poetry, you study under a creative writer. You study under someone who does the craft, not teaches the craft, because I can't believe how many teachers don't get it. It's
Yeah.
really astounding.
Yeah. Well, poetry seems to be kind of diminished in our culture in many ways.
Oh,
I
yeah.
don't think we have the appreciation of
Yeah.
poetry.
Well, they think it's very la rhymey
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
that we don't, you know, and that doesn't appeal to me either. That's not the
Right.
kind of poetry I like. But yeah, it used to be in Plath and Hughes's time, you would open up the Atlantic Monthly and they would have pages devoted to poetry. And the New York Times was full of poetry. And the New Yorker, of course, celebrated poetry. They still do a little in the New Yorker, but not like they used to.
Right.
And so it was a regular part of the reading experience. It was, you know, the other genre that you had to take in to be an educated, intelligent person. And
Right.
we don't see that anymore, sadly.
Yeah, well, reading your book, it occurred to me, I recently ordered a book of poetry of Gary Schneider because I
Nice.
do a lot of, my background is a lot of religion and ecology and whatnot. And
Yeah.
I'm like, oh, I need this, I need this. But then reading your book, I'm like, oh, I need to order some Sylvia Plath poetry because all I've got is a copy of The Bell Jar.
Uh-huh.
And it occurred to me, I'm like, I think I have a book of Walt Whitman. And I'm like, I think I need more poetry in my life, and then
Cool.
it started getting me to think, why don't we have poetry in our lives anymore?
Yeah, yeah. So my first book is no longer in print, unfortunately. We can tell your listeners, though, I do sell PDFs of it for just
Okay.
$5.
Okay.
That's Fixed Stars Govern a Life. I have two books on Magi Press that are quick studies, Decoding Sylvia Plath's Daddy and Decoding Sylvia Plath's Lady Lazarus, what I call kind of the greatest hits. I intend to do more of those, but if you want to see kind of a quick analysis of what I'm doing when
Right.
I say, you know, how I break down her work in these different ways, you might like to try, you know, looking at either Daddy or Lady Lazarus, her two most famous poems.
Right. Right.
And you can pick those up on Amazon for like $10, those books.
Okay.
And you'll get an idea of what I'm talking about when I talk about these different meanings. And I promise it will astound you.
Yeah. Yeah. I will do that because it has awakened a new interest, I think.
Awesome.
And
Thank you.
yeah, and I had read also in conjunction with Sylvia Plath, I had read Anne Sexton as well at the same time. So I knew a little bit about that friendship that they had.
Yeah. Sexton was cool and she
Yeah.
was fierce and she definitely crossed the boundaries of the day and she definitely inspired Sylvia. There are a couple of poems that I believe came of Sylvia's that I believe came directly from Anne Sexton's work. But I don't think Sexton, I've not come across anything to make me think Sexton was a mystic in any way.
Right. Yeah. I don't remember anything mystical at all in reading her, but again, it's been like 30 years.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I just knew that they had that relationship. So, the other element that runs through the book, and I have to admit, I am unfortunately very unfamiliar with this, but it is Sylvia Plath's copy of Middlemarch by George Eliot.
Yeah, yeah. I couldn't let that go. I actually wrote a version of the Occult Sylvia Plath without that book part, but I was so fascinated in the parallel of her life
Yeah.
and Middlemarch. It was crazy. And she had, yeah, so I have a number of book themes. When she was little, there was this book, The Silver Pencil, that really
Mm,
paralleled her life. And I know that Plath saw it because of
mm,
the underlinings, because of the
right.
stars and the margins, the comments. And so Plath recognized that her book, or that her life was, paralleling all these books. But Middlemarch may be the most of all. And there was so much when I was sitting in the Plath archives and looking at these underlinings, and she would do exclamation points in the margins by some things and stars by some things. And her husband became Lydgate, and even her professor, there was a name that was really close
Mm,
to her professors. And yeah, it was just uncanny. It's like, are we living the same life over and over? And maybe Plath was George Eliot, and maybe Middlemarch
mm,
was George Eliot's, version of the bell jar.
right, right, right.
The life kind of disintegrating and the marriage coming apart, and yeah, it's astounding to me.
Mm, yeah.
And so I had to include it ultimately, and I was really happy that Inner Traditions / Destiny Books wanted to keep that in, because I was afraid it was going to be too much, because the Occult Sylvia Plath is not a quick read, but I really thought that was valuable, and so did they. Yeah,
Yeah.
pretty wild, huh?
Yeah, yeah. And forgive my ignorance here, but wasn't George Eliot a pseudonym? Wasn't that a female
Yes,
author?
this
Yeah,
female author. I've forgotten her real name. If somebody said it, it would
yeah,
come to me, but
yeah,
I can't
yeah.
remember it off the tip of my tongue.
Yeah, I don't know. I just remembered, I thought that it was a
You're
female
correct.
pseudonym. Good. Yeah, it was interesting, the synchronicities with all of it. So maybe you're right. Maybe it was a kind of a reincarnation aspect, or who knows. But
You're the first one to ask me about that, by the way.
yeah.
I'm happy you did. Yeah.
Well, it runs through the book. The thing that I really noticed was how you began each one with the Ouija board, and then
Uh-huh.
also how Middlemarch ran through, and it paralleled her life. And I just thought that was really fascinating.
Yeah, me
And the
too.
synchronicities. And, Sylvia and Ted also seem to be a product of their time in the sense of some of the influences, because you had noted both James Frazer's The Golden Bough and Robert Graves, who was also a poet, his book, The White
Yeah.
Goddess,
Mhm.
was deeply influential for them. And I know that at that time, those were very influential books in terms of thinking about mythology and the past. And it was, we see this in almost like precursors to the work of Joseph Campbell.
Yeah.
And along those lines, I know that you noted that Ted Hughes had the entire collection, I think, the entire collected works of Carl Jung.
hmm
Yeah.
hmm Yeah. Yeah. Big on Jung. Freud was important to Plath.
Right.
Jung also. Yeah. Anything to do with myth, they
Mm,
were like rabid for, because mythology is so loaded.
mm.
All of our psychology, all of our complexes and neuroses come from mythology,
Right. Right.
ultimately.
Right.
So,
And you
yeah.
can't really understand poetry without understanding mythology anyway.
Yeah.
So,
That's true. That's
yeah, with
true.
all the references and whatnot. So I know that we're starting to run out of time. I have to go to the airport and pick up my niece,
Oh,
unfortunately.
okay.
I mean, fortunately, I get to go pick up my niece, but unfortunately, it's
Right.
time
Right. All
constraints.
good.
But I'm curious, given the lack of attention to poetry now,
Mhm.
what would you like people to take away about Sylvia Plath as a poet?
Yeah. Yeah. That's a big question. I think my highest goal is kind of multi-level. I want them to realize that Sylvia Plath was more than just a depressive suicide.
Yeah.
I want them to see the power of not only her words, but of words.
Mm.
And I believe that this really shows, you can call it God, you can call it energy, you can call it the Kabbalah, which is basically a universal framework,
Mm.
there's something going on that's bigger than us.
Mm.
And I want the readers to take that away too. And I believe that words can tap into it, if not fully channel it.
Mm.
And to me, that's exciting as hell.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and it feels to me like we are in a place where more and more people are opening up to that right now. That it just
We
seems
need
like,
it, right? We
yeah,
need some kind of faith, some kind of hope. It's an age of nihilism and misery and
yeah,
depression.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, for sure. And I guess that's the one final thing I forgot to mention was that, and you kind of touched on this a little bit when you mentioned that the newspapers, that Sylvia Plath had kind of referenced newspapers, but she also referenced current events in her poetry.
Yes,
And
very
yeah,
much.
yeah,
Yeah, her October poems, the poems she wrote in October 1962, which are thought to be the most powerful poems that she ever wrote, that all happened during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And the missile crisis is, well, it's through them. I mean, if you read it just with that lens, you will see it. And it, again, it's astounding. No one ever thought to do it.
yeah,
You look at Ariel, and Ariel it's clearly referencing like the bombing of Hiroshima in Japan, and Nagasaki, and the turning to vapor, and
mm,
and shadow, and skin flaking off. And I mean, she's got it all in graphic detail as it appeared in Life magazine.
mm,
In her times, it was recent for her. And she was so afraid with the Cuban Missile Crisis that this was going to happen to the
right,
world.
right,
She was terrified of World War III, as
mm,
everyone was back then.
right,
And people don't know how to read her work. They don't know how to see this stuff. It's
yeah.
beyond me. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. And I'm trying to remember if in any like English class that I took, or I took many creative writing courses, I don't think that we ever read Sylvia Plath.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah,
Yeah,
which is
I did.
unfortunate. Yeah.
I did. I remember being an undergraduate and reading like cuts, and
Okay.
and and being interested in her
Hmm.
enough to remember that.
Right, right.
But I can't say that I was fully swallowed up until
Yeah.
graduate school.
Right.
And that was when it was just like, oh my God. But as I said, I had to develop as a poet too.
Hmm.
So it's when you understand what poetics can do, and then you see it.
Right.
And so maybe it's not for everybody, but I'm trying to make it for everyone. I'm trying to
Yeah.
show everyone.
Yeah. Well, it seems to me that, that connection that I've been kind of teasing out between, the spirit and the, Ted Hughes and the shamanic and invocations and whatnot, that there's a spirit to poetry. And
Mhm.
that's what we need to kind of reclaim now is, we need spirit again, it seems.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I agree.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
where the life is, right?
Yeah. Yeah,
I
it
mean,
is.
what's the purpose without, like, really just existing right now in this moment, and that's it?
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
how
Yeah.
sad. No connections, no,
Yeah.
like,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. It seems like we have a dreadful lack of poetry, even if, like in song lyrics, and I can't say that I know all, but there seems to be, before there had been like poetry, and now it's like, eh.
Mhm.
Where's the magic in it all? Where's the magic?
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
so the final question is, and forgive me if this is repetitive of what I just recently asked, but if there was anything else that you would like someone to know about Sylvia Plath, anything that we haven't talked about or I haven't pulled out from the book, is there anything else that you would like people to know about Sylvia Plath?
Oh, just that she was so much more than the schools will tell you, or that Hollywood will tell you.
Yeah.
And yeah, and so I'm trying to show that. And,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
and beyond show it, I'm trying to build a hard case for it
Right.
with solid evidence
Mm-hmm.
in her words
Yeah.
and her underlinings and,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
different
Yeah.
expression.
Your book is a solid scholarly work, but it
Yeah.
doesn't read like a boring,
That was what I
treatise that
wanted.
you might read. It was, like I said, it was engaging. It was well written, pulled me in, and I was very much looking for, because I can only read so much each day, but I was really looking forward to getting back into the book.
Thank you. That
Yeah.
means a lot to me, Nick.
Yeah, yeah. No, it was incredibly well done. So the final questions, these are always the questions that I ask. What are you working on next? What's coming up next for you?
So I have a memoir of the years that I ran a music magazine in the 1990s as a single mom.
Okay.
And I have had 3 different book contracts on this over the years that have fell through for various reasons. And I'm really feeling called to get that out. So I'm going to be shopping for a publisher, but difficult to do that in the midst of the book tour and everything.
Mhm.
I'm all over the United States and in England this year.
Okay.
And that's exciting. And
Yeah.
I'm talking about the Occult Sylvia Plath and my last book, Tarot Life Lessons.
Hmm.
And so, I want to give these books I've just put out all the attention I can. It's very difficult to do all that and start a new creative
Right.
project. But yeah, my 2 things, I used to say I'll die happy when I
Mm.
publish the Occult Sylvia Plath, Night Times, which is my memoir,
Mm.
and a collection of my own poetry.
Yeah.
I've published many poems separately, but not a collection. So that's on my radar too. Nothing really new. I want to finish birthing the
Mm.
projects I've started,
Okay.
and so we'll see where those go.
All right. And you said that you're going to be various places. Do you have that information on your website?
Yeah, I'm continually adding dates all the
Mm.
time. In fact, I have to put up there. I just got a Cincinnati date,
Okay.
a Conroe, Texas date, and a Colorado Springs date that I have yet to
Oh,
put on.
when are you
Um,
going to be in the Springs?
in Colorado Springs, I believe it's early October. So look at my website. I'll get it updated in the next day or two for that. But juliagordonbramer.com is my website.
Okay. Well, I'm in Denver now, so
Oh,
when you're in Colorado Springs, I will come down and see your presentation, and say
fantastic.
hello and meet you in person. Um,
Awesome, Nick. I would
yeah,
love that.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Where, just out of curiosity, do you know where are you going to be in the Springs?
It's like a mind body spirit festival kind of thing.
Oh,
So
okay. All
I'll be
right.
reading tarot cards and
Okay.
presenting on my books.
Okay.
So yeah.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Yeah, I'll come down for
Yeah.
that. And
Oh,
I'll bring
great.
my best friend who I think is the person who actually introduced me to Sylvia Plath. So,
Fantastic. I love
okay.
it.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah, yeah. Well, I'll look forward to that. So I'm glad you mentioned that. So, all right. Well, Juliet, thank you so much. I really
Thank you.
appreciated the conversation and I loved the book. And I really encourage, even if someone isn't all that familiar with Sylvia Plath, to pick up a copy and maybe that will kindle.
Yeah, it's a fascinating life,
Yeah.
even if you're not following her art. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
just to
yeah,
see what happened.
yeah. Well, I think it's an excellent contribution to Sylvia Plath studies,
Yeah.
and
Thank you.
much needed, much needed. So, all right. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you, Nick. It was great talking to you again. See you for the next book.
Yeah. And that's a wrap on episode 147 of Rebel Spirit Radio. Thank you so much for listening or watching if you're a part of my YouTube audience. Now, before anything else, I would like to express my deep gratitude to Stephen Lundy for becoming my latest Patreon member. Stephen, I truly appreciate your support of the podcast and what I'm trying to build here. So, from the bottom of my heart, thank you. If you would like to be like Stephen and support my work here on Rebel Spirit Radio, please be like Stephen. You too can join my Patreon, which has several perks for members, including early access to episodes, book club, ad-free episodes. I do know how annoying ads can be. There's also a private Facebook group, and you can get access to the Rebel Spirit Radio Discord server. Honestly, there aren't too many other members at the moment, but I'm hoping that will change and we can create a thriving community of rebel spirits. And of course, please share this episode with friends, family, and on social media. Help me grow my audience. Also, please subscribe to the podcast on whatever platform you use to listen to or view podcasts. You know the grind. But here's the thing, all of that is really important. Right now, putting together this podcast is a labor of love, and I do love it, but it's very time consuming, especially since I always read my guest book when they have one, so I can have an engaged and informed conversation with them. Many of my guests have told me they appreciate that I've taken the time to do my research. Not every podcaster does that. I hope you, my faithful audience, appreciates it as well. I'm in the process of making changes to improve the podcast and the YouTube channel. I'd like to create some educational videos, for example. I'm currently working on two separate projects, one on Stan Groff and the other on Ralph Metzner. It's slow going, but your support will help me speed up the process and ensure that I can continue with the podcast and offer much more content than what I provide now. So I always say, I'm here in the Front Range doing missionary work in regards to religion, spirituality, and ecology, consciousness, and psychedelics, and how all of this can help us heal humanity's relationship with the sacred earth. So if you feel moved by the rebel spirit, and you know I sure hope that you do, then please, by all means, help me in my efforts to share the good news. I'm Nick Mather, and you've been listening to or watching Rebel Spirit Radio. Until next time, may you be in peace, may you flourish in all possible ways, and may you continue to nurture your rebel spirit.